exploited. This is the exploiter.
Hierarchy as it exists in the family. Hierarchy as it exists in the school.
Is it right that so many people live in such poverty in a society surrounded by such riches? No, it obviously is not.
Because of the way this society is organized, because of the violence that exists on the surface everywhere, you have to expect that there are going to be such explosions. You have to expect things like that as reactions.
Hello and welcome back to Red in the Face. We're now on to episode 7 already, which seems ridiculous. Today we're going to be talking a bit about the proposed annexation of some more of the West Bank by Israel and some of issues around the Arab-Israel conflict more broadly. We have another special guest this week. I'd like to introduce Hamza. Hamza is a graduate of Politics and IR from the University of Leicester, and he was a prominent member of the Palestinian society there. He has a little claim to fame that I think it would be interesting for him to talk about. If you want to talk a little bit about that, Hamza.
Yeah, so Mark Regev came onto our campus, interesting enough, because he was doing a tour across the UK.
Explain who he is.
So Mark Regev is, I think he is now the ex-UK Israeli ambassador. I think there's a new one now. And yeah, essentially he came in to do a talk about, of course, everything good about Israel. And yeah, so us guys, as Palestinian society and Palestinian students launched a campaign or a protest to essentially voice our frustration with the university and also the society that did introduce him on campus. So yeah, we were trying to do that. We consulted obviously all the relevant authorities at Leicester and also the union. And yeah, so we had posters, flyers, we were ready to go. We were going to walk out as soon as he started speaking. So it was a peaceful protest. And essentially, well, first of all, let me just go back in talking about the fact that they were ticketing the event. So essentially, they knew who was attending the event. And also, as soon as I got in, they kind of looked at me a bit, oh, who's this brown guy? Suspicious brown guy.
I was going to say, was there a racial profiling element to it as well?
100%. So I had like a big puffer jacket because I wanted to hide my poster or my banner, which is fuck Mark Regev. So yeah, I was walking in, they were looking at me a bit suspicious. As I walked in, I sat down for like 5 minutes and they called my name out. By they, I mean the Israeli security ambassadors, so not the University of Leicester security, it was the actual Israeli security ambassadors. So I was just like, fuck me, like how do they know who I am? But anyways, yeah, they were just having a conversation with me. They wanted to know what I was about and what I wanted to do. Essentially, I told them that it's a peaceful protest and we were just going to walk out as soon as Mark Regev essentially spoke. They reluctantly agreed, but yeah, they told me I can sit back down. 2 or 5 minutes later, I can't remember, there was a few students who were part of Palestine society were also racially harassed and were questioned by not only the Israeli security ambassadors, but also the University of Leicester security too. And then a couple of minutes later, my name was called out again, but this time it was by the security team that was employed by the university. And as I walked out, there was 3 Israeli, I remember this vividly, there was 3 Israeli security guards alongside the security guard from University of Leicester, essentially interrogating me and asking me to come down to the basement because basically the lecture theatre was like a floor above. And I was just like, fuck this, like, no, not without a representative from the Students' Union body. So I got a representative, I walked downstairs with them, and there was like 2 or 3 Metropolitan Police officers there as well. And essentially, it was a tactic purposely used to intimidate me and preventing this protest from actually happening. And yeah, they were just asking about why I'm here, the fact that I looked suspicious because I had a big puffer jacket and it was quite hot. To be fair, it was quite hot, but still, like, there's no reason for why you would think I'm suspicious because you obviously know I'm part from Palestinian society. They wanted me to take off my jacket and give them the banner. I gave them the banner and I said I want to go inside because I still want to lead the protest. They said, give me five. The University of Leicester security dude said to me that basically you need to wait until I go in and find out what the scene is, and then you can come back inside. So I waited for 5 minutes, and mind you, I was with 2-3 police officers, and my history with police officers have never been great, so that's another story. But yeah, I was very frustrated, I was very angry, I recorded them, and then eventually after like 5-10 minutes, the security team came downstairs and told me that I can't attend the panel, the events, and I would have to leave. And I'm just like, fuck this shit. So I just walked off. I was really pissed off, and yeah, there was a big hoo-ha about it for the next 2-3 months. The university eventually gave in and they offered an apology. Mind you, this apology was
what was that? Was that published anywhere or?
Yeah, so basically what happened was essentially I met up with the then registrar of the university. I spoke to him about my frustration and what happened, and he offered to send an apology letter, and I said I wanted public, and he also said that I'm more than happy to write an email or a letter to the Israeli embassy in the UK. And he mentioned, and he wanted me to understand as well that this letter is going to be diplomatic. So essentially it was there to like let me know that the impression that gave me was that the university was on the side of the Israeli ambassador and not the individuals or the students who have been harassed on their own campus. But yeah, essentially I was like, I want this letter to be drafted and sent to me so I can have a look at it. And I gave him all the details that I wanted in the letter. So yeah, for the next 3 months, we were going back and forth, and I had to edit my own apology letter, which is ridiculous. And yeah, eventually, 3 months later, or 2.5 months later down the line, they published the apology letter on a random Twitter post, randomly on a random date. We didn't know, we just found out. And it was just a link to the apology letter. So it wasn't actually the apology letter, just a link to it. So yeah, that happened. And after that, I was just pissed off, and I was like, I don't want anything to do with the university or the students' union for a bit. I just wanted to focus on myself and focus on my well-being. But yeah,
I don't blame you. I mean, just even if you take out the sort of the content of what you were protesting or the issue, just purely from like what would they call it, like a safeguarding standpoint, like the university should not have been letting you talk to these security of this Israeli ambassador like on your own without one of them there at all. It's just crazy. And then obviously when you add the content, it's sinister because it shows that you're not allowed to peacefully protest in this country, and universities are meant to be these safe spaces for like radical leftism or whatever.
I was going to say, was there ever like a, when you're talking about you have to do this apology, did they ever sort of threaten? Was there like an implied threat or a clear threat that if you didn't apologise, they would just cancel your studies? Or anything like that, or?
To be fair to them, it wasn't so much of a threat, really. They didn't really threaten me with anything. The university in itself was, I would say they were apologetic in the sense that they were like, shit, they got this wrong. So they felt bad for themselves in a way, as opposed to actually caring for the actual students on campus. So for them, they realized this is already published on newspaper. It's gained traction in the NUS as well, the National Union Body too. And yeah, they were in like it's basically a shit show for them. They're like, shit, we need to protect ourselves. So for them, they knew that if they threatened me with like expelling me from my studies or anything like that, they would essentially know that their reputation is under threat. So they would have to do something about it. And yeah, it was quite disingenuous, I think, with the apology letter, given the fact that it took them 3 months and I would have to edit it myself. But yeah, there was no threat from the university in that sense, to be fair.
Yeah, I just thought it was an interesting story to introduce because you with, because it shows your passion for Palestinian issues, and also it's it's an interesting story about what you are and what you aren't allowed to do and say when it comes to Israel Palestine as well. So yeah, we'll go from there. I thought before we talk about the current plans to annex more of the West Bank, Israel annexing more of the West Bank, I thought we'd talk a little bit about the history in terms of land exchange. Well, exchange is the wrong word, but land grabs and what the map has looked like in Israel Palestine over the last 100 or so years. Would anyone else want to do that, or I don't mind going over it? Or so just for people who don't know, to give some context. Essentially, the land that is Palestine was once. This is off the top of my head mostly. So the land that was the land of Palestine was once part of the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War, the British basically took over, and it was known as like the British Mandate in Palestine for 30 years, I think, from like 1917 to 1947, 48. In that time, I think there was an encouragement for sort of Jewish settlers to migrate to the land of Palestine in the hope that they would one day establish a Jewish homeland there. And they were encouraged by the British. There was the Balfour Declaration, which everyone knows about, which is, what year was that?
1917.
1917, which was essentially a promise on Britain's part that there would be a Jewish homeland created in historic Palestine. After the Second World War, there was an even greater increase in migration to Palestine, obviously in part because of the horror of the Holocaust and things like that, but also because the Zionist project has long been to establish a Jewish homeland in the region. Then, as more and more Jewish settlers came into Palestine, there was inevitably more and more conflict between the Arab natives and the settlers. The British kind of bottled it at that point, didn't they? They after the war, they kind of didn't want any part of it, because any involvement they have was just, as they saw it, making the situation worse. They left it to the UN to come up with a partition plan in which roughly 50% of the land would be given to Jewish settlers to create Israel, or what would become known as Israel. That, I think, resulted in sort of more clashes between the settlers. And then, this is the bit where my history is a little bit iffy, but essentially then there was a war broke out, wasn't it? The Arab states in the region sort of declared war, or there was a war broke out at some time around after the war. Israel won and managed to push back even further than the UN partition plan, right? I think, to the point where they had about 70% of the land. The West Bank went to Jordan, so Jordan controlled the West Bank, and then Gaza was controlled by Egypt. And then they don't want to take over from there. So I'm trying to think what happened in 1967, the Six-Day War. Does anyone know their history better than me on that, in that area?
Yeah, so essentially the idea of Zionism as a political ideology was essentially created by evangelical Christians, particularly politicians and lobbyists in the UK, to essentially expel Jewish people from Europe and create like their own homeland. So essentially this idea of Zionism in itself and the creation of Israel was based on anti-Semitism in a way, which is quite ironic when we later discuss about anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism. And it's really important to highlight that Balfour, despite the fact that he had this declaration to establish a homeland for the Jewish state, for Jewish populations, he was actually a renowned anti-Semite himself. I mean, he called Jewish people hostile and alien creatures, which is kind of ironic when we think about the fact that this person was supposed to be an advocate for Jewish self-determination, well, why is he then spewing out these anti-Semitic comments? Fast forward to, let's say, to 1920s. Obviously, the UK has a mandate over Palestine now, and there is this idea of like, so essentially there was like the British Army, the British troops essentially came in. They suppressed suppressed a lot of Arab revolts against the British people, and in particular there was a individual called Ord Wingate, who was a British army officer, and he was assigned as an international officer in the British mandate of Palestine, and with the permission of the British commander, known as General Haining, I believe, he created the Special Night Squads, which is essentially gathering what we know the IDF forces now, so the Jewish police officers back then, and gathering them and training them to actually suppress Arab revolts against the British mandate, and also the influx of colonial settlers. And so this was ongoing. So there's actual suppression and actual revolt against Palestinians. Fast forward, obviously we have in 1938, the British military commander came in, Bernard Montenegro, I believe, who essentially called the Arab people disgusting and asked the Jewish forces to essentially shoot them whenever they can. So there was an ongoing, you know how we talk about Nakba being like in 1948 and there were 750,000 Palestinians displaced. There was still an ongoing Nakba before the actual Nakba. So there was ongoing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians.
There were a lot of reports, weren't there, made by the British that talked about the Jews in the region being much more civilized.
Yeah.
They preferred them. I've read some of this stuff, and it's just saying how they preferred they're more civilized people, more sort of culturally the same, they would say, I suppose. Yeah, so exactly, a lot of racism from the offset.
And this is kind of what like Edward Said kind of highlights about this idea of the Arab Muslim being primitively backwards because of the theology. And then what this does is actually it differentiates between the Western European white origins and the Arab world in order to enhance and create to support the colonialist imperialist agenda of the British state. So yeah, fast forward to that, obviously we get the 1948 Nakba, which is known as the catastrophe for a lot of Palestinians. Obviously a lot of Israeli people, a lot of Israeli citizens celebrate this day, but a lot of Palestinians use this day to mourn the dead and also think about all the people that have...
Let's talk about that a bit more, because I realised I just tried to kind of summarise the entire history of Israel in a couple minutes. So let's slow it down and talk a bit about that more broadly in the Nakba. So yeah, carry on.
So yeah, the Nakba was essentially the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. It was the annexation of, I believe, the Gaza Strip, and I think the West Bank was in 1967. Could get that wrong, I'm not entirely sure, can't remember. But yeah, it was the annexation of Palestinian territory, and it was the creation of the Israeli state. Despite the fact that 80% of the people that are living in the Israeli occupied state was actually Palestinian, but 55% were only 45% were given the land, and the rest were pretty much Israeli citizens or quote unquote Israeli citizens and Jewish citizens. So essentially, that is the Nakba in its essence. I mean, there's obviously a lot of case studies and horrifying stories of the Nakba. But yeah, that is
about half the Palestinian population at the time had to flee, didn't they? The Arab population, roughly half, like 700,000, like you say.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's a lot of debate among historians, obviously, especially in Israel, about what happened in the Nakba, about whether there was a forced expulsion or whether they left of their own accord. There's these old historians in Israel. I'm trying to think of Ephraim Karsh, I think, is the main guy, who basically says that the Arabs at the time left of their own accord because they didn't want to be part of a new Jewish state, and there's plenty of openly Zionist historians who contend that isn't true, Benjamin Morris being the primary one, and then there are also anti-Zionist historians who say the same, like Ilan Pappe, like you mentioned. So essentially, the consensus, I think, among serious scholars is that they were forced from their homes, and there was a lot of violence and a lot of suppression on the part of the Jewish settlers at the time.
Yeah, I just wanted to give a shout out to Ilan Pappe and his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And I think it goes into a fair bit of detail about the origins of the Zionist ideology, but it's a really in-depth account of exactly what happened in the 40s, and it does discuss stuff prior to the 40s as well, but a lot of the book is focused on what was called Plan Dalet. It's the fourth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, so it's Plan D, so there's Plan A, B, C, and then D. And Plan Dalet is essentially just fucking murder people and force them from their homes and push them out of this territory. And by any sort of definition, and Ilan Pappe draws on the UN Human Rights Council's definition, what occurred in 1947, 1948 was absolutely ethnic cleansing. And Israel still denies to this day that they ethnically cleansed things. And, you know, like you've said, the openly Zionist historians who have sort of fabricated this entire narrative around how the Arabs just got up and left because they didn't want to be a part of it, when the reality is that Zionist settlers came in, they started bombing homes, even in cities that were very multicultural, like Haifa, where it's about 50-50 population-wise. The Zionist settlers started indiscriminately bombing people, and a lot, including Jews, by the way. It wasn't just Arabs who were bombed by the Zionists. You know, there were a lot of people living, sort of intermingling with Arab families. So essentially, everyone who didn't support the Zionist project was fucked, but Arabs were specifically targeted by the predecessor organizations of the IDF.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like an interesting point you kind of mentioned about how essentially Zionist organizations were targeting not only Arabs but also Jewish citizens that already existed in modern-day Palestine. Essentially, Ilan Pappe kind of highlights this, how the influx of the initial Jewish migrations in Palestine, they were actual peaceful citizens who did not want to colonize the Arabs, but actually want to settle alongside them and live with them live with them in harmony as well. And this is kind of highlighted in the Palestinian I can't remember what it's called, but I think it's the PLC. It's one of like the legislations back then in Palestine that they wanted to provide the Jewish settlers an equal right to what the Palestinians already have, and the Jewish people were completely happy with that. So when we think about the influx of Jewish migration, we need to also understand that it wasn't just Zionists who came in and destroyed what is now called Israel, and destroyed Palestinian lives, but actually Jewish people came in, and the initial influx of Jewish people were essentially peaceful people who just wanted to live there and wanted to escape the harsh reality of Europe.
I think that highlights an important, like you've both said a couple of things that highlights an important aspect of this, that Zionism is separate from Jewishness. And Zionism, I mean, there's a big Christian Zionist movement among the British elite. Like we were talking about Balfour. Like you said, he said some horribly anti-Semitic things, but he was still a Zionist because of different reasons. I'm not sure actually exactly what those reasons would be. Would anyone? I think, is it a biblical thing? The idea of the Jews returning to. This is just something I'm not an expert on at all, but I'm just interested in why there is a lot of secular and Christian Zionism among non-Jewish people.
I think when we highlight Arthur Balfour, I think what we need to understand is, well, I'm not going to go too much in theology because I'm not an expert on theology and understanding of that, but in terms of just a political understanding of Palestine, Balfour was obviously in 1917, he was at the end of the World War, but he also realized that there was not enough ammunition for the military to suppress or to fight the war. And there was a scientist named Chaim Weizmann, I believe, and he was the first Israeli president in 1948. And he initially created compounds for the gunpowder that the British were short on during the World War One. In exchange, Balfour kind of agreed that obviously Chaim Weizmann being he was a staunch Zionist as well. In exchange, Balfour agreed that there will be the creation of the Jewish state in Palestine. So yeah, just contextualizing that and understanding how essentially the military in itself and the British state in itself co-opted the very legitimate cause of Jewish self-determination to actually suit their own agenda, to actually fight their own wars, but also hijack what was a very, like I said, what was a very legitimate cause, but at the end create what is Palestine now and essentially ethnically cleanse Palestinian people.
In terms of religion, a lot of theological historians sort of say that Zionism grew out of this Protestant Reformation sort of era, which was like mid-17th century. So essentially, the establishment of Israel and the return of the Jewish population to the Holy Land was basically a prerequisite for Christ's second coming. So they said Christ would only return to earth once Israel was established and once the Jewish people were settled there. And they sort of took that movement, Christian Zionism, Christian restorationism, and passed it on to Jewish circles almost. They sort of transplanted the idea almost, and got that debate going within Jewish theological circles.
Right, so if we then move on, so I'm glad that we've actually decided to have a wider discussion about history, because it's obviously one of the most important things on the issue. I shouldn't have tried to skim across so much. But so yeah, so we have the Nakba. So let's just talk a bit about what the map looks like now. So the map from 1948 to 1967 is the West Bank, and the West Bank is part of Jordan, Transjordan, is that what it's called? Yeah. Gaza is part of Egypt, and the rest of historic Palestine is now Israel, which is like 70% or something of it. So then in 1967, we have the 6-Day War. Was that started by the Arab states in the region to try and reclaim some land, or how did that start?
I think it's a little contentious on who started. It's one of those wars where there's a bit of disagreement over who was responsible for it and who actually started first. But I suppose it's not entirely relevant who did it first. But the outcome is that Israel occupied Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula, and they did return it later, as far as I'm aware. I think they returned Sinai later, but they occupied it for some time.
To Egypt. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It was, so the Sinai Peninsula is part of Egypt, and it was occupied by Israel. And the war largely kicks off due to, I think it's largely due to rights to the Suez Canal. So Egypt at this point has rights to the Suez Canal, but I think the war kicks off because Egypt and the other Arab states were talking about a boycott of Israel, because obviously these other Arab states, whatever their reasons may have been, and I'm sure anti-Semitism did play a part in it, they rejected the state of Israel. They did not recognize it. And so there's always, since Israel's foundation, been a lot of tension between the Arab states and Israel. But they were basically talking about united action against Israel. And then that happened in the 6-Day War. And the result is that the Arab states essentially backed down during the war. They didn't perform too well. And Israel occupied more land and used that as a pretext to commit more ethnic cleansing in Palestine.
So they occupied the West Bank and Gaza, didn't annex them, although that's obviously what we're going to be talking about in a bit. But they occupied the West Bank and Gaza. As it's 6 days, they basically destroyed the Arab armies, didn't they? It was a brutal, it was an effective campaign on the Israelis' part, largely because of Western funding, I would imagine. So they had an effective military. So since then, there's been a process of what some people call creeping annexation. So some Jewish settlers in the region have been slowly settling on more and more of Palestinian territory. There's contention again about whether the government is encouraging that, but I think today you'd be hard pressed to find someone serious who would deny that the government is supporting some of these settlements, especially given the fact that now that is what they're looking at annexing. There's obviously a lot more history between 67 and now, but some of the main parts was in 2005, Israel left Gaza unilaterally but they still control their borders. So the West Bank is now. So if we talk about what the situation is like now in terms of land, the West Bank is like, what's the word? There's a word they used to describe it. I think it's bastardized or sort of bastard. I don't know how to pronounce it. Basically, it's like a piece of land where there are separate little enclaves, and they're all kept very separate from each other. So the settlers, I think they have area A, B, and C, don't they? C being settler communities, which are fully protected by the IDF, the Israeli military. Section A is like the most autonomous zones in the West Bank, where Palestinians have the most control. But even there, the IDF is involved, and then B is somewhere in between. I'm not sure exactly how it works, but basically, Palestine is not free currently. It's controlled by Israel. Their movements are controlled. Their land's taken slowly by settlers, and then the government backing up those settlers. And now, with the encouragement from Trump, is what it looks like anyway, Netanyahu has promised that he's going to annex more Palestinian land in the West Bank. So he said he's going to annex all settler communities, which makes up, do we know how much of the West Bank that makes up? It's a serious proportion. I think I read something like 60%, and he wants to annex the entire Jordan Valley as well, which is the side of the West Bank that borders with Jordan. So do we want to talk a bit about, I thought it'd be interesting to get your guys' views on why you think no one's talking about this. Because annexation is a big deal, right? Do you remember when Russia annexed Crimea, and it was all over the news? It was like the main thing on the news for weeks and weeks and weeks, as it should be. Like, whatever you think about it, I'm not an expert on that. But it's currently something that's not being talked about. I know there's a lot of things going on in the world at the minute, but in the mainstream media, at least, it's something that is not being discussed, and it is a serious deal. So does anyone have any opinions on why that might be?
Yeah, I think first, let's just establish what annexation is, just for the viewers' sake. So annexation is the forcible acquisition of one state's territory by another state. It is generally an illegal act under international law. So essentially, annexation of a land is illegal in a sense. It's occupying someone else's territory, and it's illegal under, I believe, the Geneva Convention and other UN international laws. And just back to your question, Morgan, about how essentially we were quick to condemn, well, we essentially British were quick to condemn Russia for the annexation of Crimea, but very reluctant or just want to turn a blind eye to what's happening in Israel, because the way I see it is that the British still have a vast interest in the region of the Middle East. So therefore, it would be foolish for them to condemn what's happening in Israel. Furthermore, when it comes to Israel, we also not Israel, sorry. When it comes to Russia, we understand from just historical facts that British and America have had this issue with Russia for centuries and for years. So of course they would be quick to essentially condemn what Russia's doing, but very slow to condemn what Israel are doing. Furthermore, I do believe that there is a we need to have this conversation about race and racism as well. Obviously Palestinians being a majority Muslims, they said this goes back down to viewing Muslims as beastly and the other, and viewing them as barbaric in terms of the religion and not just being developed enough. So when we put that into context and we understand how Muslims have been portrayed historically, we then understand how this idea that Israel can continue doing what it's doing and the British can maintain its control also roots from the fact that they view the Palestinians as being barbaric and as individuals who don't deserve the rights as equal citizens as Israeli citizens in general. So there's a very racial dynamic played here as well, I believe, in personally.
Yeah, absolutely, and that can be seen, like we were just talking about at the beginning, like right from the off, when we were talking about those reports where they're talking about the way they feel about the Arabs that they find when the British controlled Palestine. So yeah, I definitely think there's both that racial element. I mean, Islamophobia seems to be the most acceptable form of discrimination at the minute, doesn't it? So there's that, and then there's also the military and the sort of strategic element, because Israel's essentially the West's sort of military offshoot, isn't it, in the region, and it allows them to, they have that there for when they need it, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, Israel's a key ally of the US and UK in the region. It would be political suicide to sort of suddenly condemn Israel and cut them off. It'd be a nonsensical decision in terms of the interests of Western imperialism. But since we're talking about Islamophobia, I just want to quickly sort of drop a point about homo nationalism. Homo nationalism, basically, is sort of using sexual identity politics, in a sense, to further a nationalist political agenda. So it's something that we see quite a lot with far-right groups in Europe. Like, if you look at far-right groups in Europe, a lot of the membership, you'd think they're fucking massive homophobes. But at the same time, if you look at some of the rhetoric they talk about, I mean, look at the BNP, look at the EDL, they'll talk about how these Muslims don't respect our way of life and they hate gay people and they're going to chop gay people's heads off and so on and so forth. And there's a similar sort of rhetoric around Israel. The IDF, in sort of a similar vein, showing how moral and civilized they are, the IDF, they love to go on about how they're the world's largest vegan military, as if not oppressing cattle is somehow more important than not oppressing human beings. But there is a general tendency, especially amongst Western political figures, to sort of point to Israel as sort of a beacon of civility, and that, like, look, they respect individual rights, they respect LGBT rights, they're the best sort of country in the region, whilst all these other barbarians surrounding them don't respect gay rights. And LGBT rights in the Middle East is not something that I'm qualified to talk about, but it's not a legitimate concern for LGBT rights that drives Western governments to support Israel, because if they were concerned about LGBT rights, they'd cut off Saudi Arabia. They'd tell Saudi Arabia to go eat a fat dick,
You're talking about the reason why it's not in the news. I mean, the two presidential candidates at the minute, for example, in the US, you've got Donald Trump, who through, is it Jared Kushner, his like weird son-in-law, failed son type guy, pushing all these like Netanyahu's interest in Israel, e.g. the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, being and his ridiculous two-state solution that he drew up, where he inadvertently, did he create the biggest tunnel in the world between like the two strips? But anyway, you've got that as the one presidential candidate who basically,
which was unilateral as well.
Yeah,
no involvement from any Palestinian representatives with the Trump.
Yeah, he is just he will do and say anything that Netanyahu wants. And the other candidate is Joe Biden, who said in the Senate, if we didn't have an Israel, we'd have to create one to protect US interests. So he literally said the quiet bit out loud. Like, he literally said the reason we support them is because we need an Israel to, again, going back to that racialized version of things, it's probably to keep Arab nations in check, e.g. these rich oil nations, potentially, to keep them in check. We need to have a base there. Originally, Israel played a very, very important role, particularly amongst Arab nations, with the spread of communism and like USSR interests in Arab states. Israel played a really big role there in the US having a foothold in the region. So that's why it's not cared about in the West, because they are a reflection of US, obviously historically British imperialism and empire. So, I mean, that's the main reason. And then those relationships flow both ways.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it's an interesting point that you mention the Soviet Union, the spread of communism, because until 1947, the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia actually supported Israel, because obviously they'd just witnessed the Holocaust. There were millions of Soviet Jews. Unfortunately, millions of them did not survive the Holocaust. So the USSR until 1947 actually quite vocally supported Israel and the establishment of of a binational state in the region. But it was after the Nakba and after witnessing what the Zionists had done in Israel that the USSR and Czechoslovakia said, wow, fuck that, and they stopped sending them weapons and stopped giving them support. I'm not really sure what point specifically it is that Israel becomes so closely intertwined with the US, but the USSR was supporting all these Arab countries who were trying to fight off Western imperialism at the time. So obviously Israel is sort of the logical counterweight for that if you look at American interests versus Soviet interests in the region. I just thought that was an interesting point.
I want to talk a bit about this sort of creeping annexation point, which from 1967, Israeli settlers would settle in the West Bank and in Gaza up until 2005. And then from that point, so that originally what will happen is they'll settle, the government will typically denounce, the Israeli government will typically denounce initial settlements, but then as it becomes normalized, they then start to push for annexation. This is what Netanyahu is doing at the minute, because they then get to justify it by saying, well, this is a majority Jewish area, so of course Israel has to annex it. But it's like you've allowed them to go in and settle in that area anyway, so they get blamed. So the settlers get blamed for why Israel then needs to annex it. But it kind of seems like on purpose, if you know what I mean, on behalf of Israel. Like they're allowing these settlements to go forward so that they can slowly chip away at more and more Palestinian land. And I think this is what's meant by that creeping annexation statement. So I want to talk about, do you think that means that Israel is not serious about a two-state solution? Because if it was serious about a two-state solution, there would be one by now. The entire international community says they want a two-state solution. Israel says they want a two-state solution. Part of the Palestinian community say they want a two-state solution, and yet it hasn't happened. And I think that's partly because, on Israel's behalf, they are not serious about a two-state solution. Otherwise, there would be no settlements. What do you guys think about that?
I mean, if you just look at what's recently happening with the annexation of, I believe, the Jordan Valley and the West Bank, clearly it shows that Israel do not give a shit about a two-state solution. They want to ethnically cleanse Palestinian people and force them out of the lands to create a Jewish state. So there is, at the moment, I don't see a reason that we should even discuss a two-state solution until Palestinians actually have a right to return back to the homeland. If Israel and if its allies were serious about a two-state solution, they would give autonomy to the Palestinian people, not pass laws that discriminatorily impact Palestinians and push them away and cast them as second citizen. If Israel was serious about a two-state solution, they would stop annexing and ethnically cleansing Palestinian people and allowing them to return back to their homeland. If Israel was serious about a two-state solution, they would not do what they are doing and be complicit in what is now known an apartheid state. So I don't think that at the moment, as I see it, the fact that we have the bigger Trump and the bigger Boris in power, even when we had Obama was looking 8.4 million worth of aid to Israel every day. I think that accumulates to like billions in a year. I don't want to sound like Trump, billions, but it was literally billions. And the way I see it is that there is no, I don't see a viable future of a two-state solution as of what it is right now, unless we see a sanctioning of Israel and taking them away from membership from the UN. I don't see a two-state solution as of yet.
Well, Netanyahu has said that. I think he said in 2015, he said that a Palestinian state would not be established during his administration. So there's his mind is made up, and a lot of the government of Israel, they're just not willing to even entertain the idea. So how can you work towards building any sort of solution, whether it's a two-state or the dual citizenship idea also gets mentioned quite a lot. How can you work towards any solution when the other side of the debate, Israel, won't operate in good faith?
Isn't it? It's been a certain amount of years running that the UN have basically deemed settlement expansion illegal for just like a numerous amount of years running, which also just shows like you say, the lack of will for Israel to do anything about it. I mean, and it also goes to like liberals that are going to say sort of, we need international community consensus on this. Like there almost very much is. It out loud, the UN say, look, this shouldn't happen, and Israel obviously just go, don't give a shit. Like we're backed by America, so therefore we're fine in what we do. So like you say, there's a lot of talk by the the big state actors in this game about a solution, but they are literally the ones that could do the solution but choose not to.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get onto sort of solutions properly at the end, but one of the things, I mean, I don't support a two-state solution for reasons we'll go on to, but one of the things that I find so insidious about it is that rather than being a serious proposition on Israel's part, it actually acts as like a holding action where they get to enact this creeping annexation plan whilst under the guise of being serious about two states. So it's like it keeps them, I guess, in the international community's favour to some extent, because they get to say, yeah, we support two states, we want a viable Palestinian state.
The opposition, as a result of their creeping expansion, the opposition from Palestinian movements gets stronger. They feel like they have to take more serious action, and then Israel can position themselves to the rest of the international community as we're the, like, it's not our fault. Yeah. Look at, like, we're getting attacked by terrorists, etc. So they say, look, we're clever. We're offering a two-state solution whilst doing this creeping, and obviously, the more you oppress people, the spring is going to, spring back even harder and more fierce, and that's why you get sort of organisations from within Palestine who are trying to like fight for their survival.
It's crazy how much Israel rests and relies on a very effective propaganda machine, global propaganda machine as well. Like that highlights absolutely.
Yeah, and I just want to kind of like highlight what kind of Fanon alluded to in his book, The Wretched. If you haven't read it, definitely recommend reading it because it's brilliant. And Fanon really mentions about how essentially, how do you expect the natives to peacefully ask for the right of autonomy, the right of freedom, the freedom of movement, the freedom of economic movement, when they have been constantly bombarded with oppression after oppression after oppression, when they've tried sitting on the table, when they've tried having these conversations and nothing actually gets done. And let's just put this in perspective. This has been an ongoing issue since the Nakba 1948, but even before that. So it's been at least over 80 years, 100 years, this issue still continues. So there's no way that in the current system that we live in, and in the capitalist structure and the way systems have been organized, especially with the UN being heavily influenced by the West, I don't see how within the system that we work in that there can be a two-state solution, especially in the fact that Palestinian refugees are still not being allowed to move back into their homeland by the Israeli state, and there's actually nothing that's being done about this, whether from the British state or from the United States or any other Israeli ally, including Saudi monarchy. There's nothing that actually has been done about this, and this simply goes down back to the fact that obviously capitalism is shit. We can talk about that later, but yeah, essentially in the structure that we live in, there cannot be a two-state solution. It's not viable.
So one of the things that I find quite disturbing about this annexation plan is that Netanyahu's promised that when he annexes these parts of the Jordan Valley and other settler communities, that any Palestinians that fall within those areas, when they become quote unquote Israeli citizens, that he's basically promised that they won't be Israeli citizens, they won't have the same status as Jewish Israelis, and that obviously highlights the idea. A lot of people say it's offensive to say, but it's not. The idea that Israel is an apartheid state and there are two sets of people with two very different sets of rights, or lack thereof. So does anyone want to talk a bit about how that works, how the apartheid system works in Israel?
So yeah, essentially, so the way the apartheid system works, I'm just going to briefly talk about just some of the laws that they have passed down, and we can kind of like talk about how essentially that is apartheid. So obviously we see the recent law, I think it was passed down in 2018, which is Israel declaring itself as a nation state. It's called a nation state law, and it's been passed down. And essentially this means that only Jews have a right to self-determination and not the Palestinians. So we kind of see how this is embedded institutionally and has regulated Palestinians as second-class citizens. So essentially giving privileges to Jewish citizens as opposed to Palestinian Arabs, predominantly Muslims. It's also prevents Israel as a state prevents Palestinians from leasing land in the public domain and even owning it. For example, I think it's called the Bedouin. I'm probably butchering the name, but it's a region in Palestine, and essentially the land in itself is being demolished, and even though the fact that the Palestinians actually own the land, that's actually been taken by the Israeli settlers, and now essentially they have taken the land, they have taken the ownership of the property, and now they are able to lease it and loan it back to the Palestinians, so essentially making profits out of essentially profiting from Palestinians' own homeland, which doesn't make sense. Essentially taking their house and getting them to pay for it, which I don't know. Yeah, again, that's apartheid in itself. And since 1967, around 50,000 Palestinians' homes have been demolished across the occupied Palestinian territory, which is West Bank, I believe, Gaza Strip, and I can't remember what the third one is, but correct me if you can. And yeah, we see the continuation of the Israeli wall that divides the West Bank Palestinian people and the Israelis. So essentially what we're seeing right now is the Palestinians regulated as second-class citizens and not enjoying the equal rights as Israeli citizens. And that only, for me, that just goes to show that this is essentially a apartheid system where there's creating privileges for certain parts of the population based on their ethnicity and their religion, and deregulating other citizens based on their religion and identity. So that would be the apartheid system.
It's like Palestinians are restricted in their right to work through Israeli policies that curtail Palestinian agriculture and industry in the occupied Palestinian territories. And Israeli policies restrict the exports and imports of that territory. So, it takes away entirely from the economic autonomy of the region. So it's not treated as being Palestinian. It's sort of treated as Israel's little shithole that it just happens to control. And it's at such a point where Palestinian unemployment in the occupied territories is nearly 50%, which is just fucking colossal. You can't say that you're committed to a two-state solution or to even the ethical treatment of human beings when you're imposing these policies on them.
And the sick thing is often when they are employed, they're employed to build Jewish settlements as well, which is the most twisted aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, they're essentially employed to take part in the destruction of their own homeland, and it's the only employment that's generally available to them because they're so heavily discriminated against when it comes to finding work in any other area of Israel or of the Israeli economy.
If we talk a little bit now about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, because they're two things that are often conflated by people on both sides of that spectrum, I guess, for different reasons, obviously. So do you want to talk a bit about what is anti-Zionism? What is anti-Semitism? Can they coexist? Are they the same thing? I just want to talk about that.
For me, I think it's easier, at least for myself, to conceptualize and distinguish between the two as anti-Semitism being sort of prejudice and intolerance towards the Jewish people, followers of Judaism, and anti-Zionism as sort of critique of the state, rather than, because a lot of people do conflate the two, and I think anti-Zionism is more focused on the government and the actions of the Israeli government with regards to the Palestinian people, whereas anti-Semitism it's not confined just to a political state. It's confined to a whole people, a whole race of people.
Yeah, so Zionism essentially is the idea that there should be a Jewish homeland, a state created in the region of what was historic Palestine. So if you were a Zionist before the creation of Israel, you would believe in the creation of Israel. If you were an anti-Zionist before the creation of Israel, you would believe that it shouldn't have been created or shouldn't be. Now it means something quite different, because obviously there is now not different. It's the same thing, but the context is different, because now there is a state, a Jewish state in the region. There is in Israel. It does exist. So Zionism now, or at least in my mind, Zionism now is the expansion of that state, or the I think that's how I would describe it. So if you're an anti-Zionist, for me, that means that I don't think just at its most simple, I don't think the Israeli state should be expanded. I then believe other things, like I believe in a one-state solution. I think, but purely in terms of what anti-Zionism is you don't believe in the continuation of the building of a Jewish state in that region. Would anyone disagree with that? Or?
I just want to echo exactly what you said, Morgan. I kind of agree. What you just mentioned is the fact that anti-Zionism is essentially someone, or like an individual who is against the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people, and that is what anti-Zionism is. Whilst anti-Semitism is this idea that you do not believe that Jewish people have a right to self-determination. You do not believe that Jewish people are equal citizens to other religious or ethnic minority groups throughout the world. However, it's important to not get those terms conflated, and we need to understand that Judaism as a religion wasn't based on this aspect or the creation of a Jewish homogeny and creating everyone or ethnically cleansing everybody and creating like a Jewish nation. Zionism as a concept in itself is based on this fact that there needs to be a Jewish state, or based on the fact that there needs to be ethnic cleansing going on to eradicate indigenous people, and Judaism actually doesn't teach that. So to conflate the both, I find it very bizarre, especially when the right or the left kind of mention this idea that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
Like I say as well, it doesn't, like you say, trying to distance the two, and in terms of being, it's something that I think a lot of anti-Zionists and people that are critical of the Israeli state will have found very quickly, is that their arguments are turned into arguments that person is anti-Semitic. But it doesn't happen. The point is that you're not, I think what James said, you're not criticising Israeli government because they are, you don't think the actions that they are currently doing to Palestinian people is because they're Jewish. To say that would be anti-Semitic. To say that that's again, that's a completely wrong and abhorrent thing to say. What you're saying is the way they are acting as a state is wrong in any measure of the world. For example, Saudi Arabia and the way they, like we said earlier, treat LGBT people, the way they've acted in Yemen, near them, for example. You criticise that state for the actions that they've done. Religion doesn't come into it. We're not saying at all that they are part of this religion, therefore they are inherently going to act this way. That's racist on any scale. What you're saying is that this state is acting in this way. This state is oppressing these people, and we're going to criticise that. And it's completely, I know there's obviously a religious element to it, but it's devolved of that. It's like James is saying, anti-Zionism is saying this state is doing something wrong, and it doesn't matter what either ethnic or background you come from or religion you are, it's calling that out for what it is. And I just want to kind of highlight as well, if you ask this question to Palestinian people, they would just end up laughing at you, because essentially what you're trying to say, that either you side with the oppressor and you be a Zionist, essentially meaning that they will continue to ethnically cleanse you and your family, and they will dispose you, and you will see expandable human beings, or you're a racist. How does that make Palestinian people? So what side are they on then? So yeah, I thought that was quite, for me, like just understanding, speaking to these Palestinian people, Palestinian activists, and the fact that they're always constantly highlighted as being anti-Semitic because they're anti-Zionist and they have no way of navigating that. I find that it's very disingenuous in a sense, and essentially quite oppressive as well in its nature.
So do we want to talk a little bit about, because talking of this accusation of anti-Semitism when we're talking about anti-Zionists, I know I've been accused of it plenty of times, online at least. One famous case recently in the UK of someone being accused of anti-Semitism because of their anti-Zionism was Corbyn. There was something in the paper every week at least about how something or other showed that at the least he had some dodgy views when it came to anti-Semitism, or at most he was, the biggest anti-Semite since Hitler, or the most effective one. That sounds outrageous to say, but I've definitely read that somewhere before.
I mean, Alan Sugar literally cropped him into a picture of Hitler in a sidecar going to one of the Nuremberg rallies. So it's not that wild to suggest.
Exactly. So do we want to talk about that? I mean, was Corbyn an anti-Semite? Was he an anti-Semite because of his opposition to Zionist expansionism and his defense of Palestinian rights, or was it part of a propaganda machine to delegitimize not only a man and his views, but anti-Zionism as a political stance more generally?
I think I just kind of want to highlight how there has been incidents in the Labour Party where there has been anti-Semitic remarks or actions have been taking place within the Labour Party, and I do believe there has been at times that the Labour Party have been slow in acting on this. And this is something that Corbyn has admitted during his tenure as a leader. But I also want to highlight how when Corbyn tried to highlight these issues and bring these cases to justice and investigate this further, there have been senior Labour staff members who have essentially halted this investigation in order to portray Corbyn as someone who is inept and is unable to deal with anti-Semitism and trying to get rid of him because of the fact that they don't like his stance on Palestine and Israel, and they don't like his stance on neoliberalism and his opposition to imperialism and colonialism. They don't like to hear that from a Labour politician, and this is something that needs to be highlighted when we talk about the left being plagued with anti-Semitism. I think that, like I said, there's incidents where the left have been too slow on acting on it, but there has been senior members within the Labour Party who have purposely refused to allow Corbyn to investigate this thoroughly in order to highlight the issues and also support Jewish members in the Labour Party. And this has been a strategic and a very strategic, I would say, movement orchestrated by the left I would say the centre left, or whatever you want to call them, to essentially get rid of Corbyn and get rid of his leadership.
I think on this, that the most important thing is that Corbyn, we're supporters of the Corbyn project. We probably know each other really due to the Corbyn project. That what he did was threaten the established view on a million and one things. That's what he did. And what an establishment view is that you have to, essentially, the British state supports Israel almost uncritically, and he threatened that. And then that's not to say, like Hamza said, that both there were cases of anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. There definitely were. Corbyn made mistakes. I mean, the mural that he defended was anti-Semitic. I mean, whether he openly knew that, it's more of a case of political education and understanding that sometimes anti-Semitic tropes can be less clear than some other racist.
Like snuck in sometimes, aren't they?
Yeah, and some things that lots of people wouldn't even recognise, which are anti-Semitic tropes. So he made mistakes himself, but he clearly isn't an anti-Semite. I mean, he was fighting, like he says all the time, right? His mum was holding him in his arms in the Battle of Cable Street when Oswald Mosley was coming through going through Jewish areas of London. He was there with the anti-fascists fighting these people back. He's been an anti-fascist all his life, and he's defended, any oppressed people. But because he threatened the established view of supporting Zionism, supporting the Israeli state, the British establishment had to take him down. And one of the ways they tried to take him down was labelling him with this accusation of anti-Semitism, which there were some cases of anti-Semitism, genuine cases of anti-Semitism, and he made mistakes. But I do think it was part of that that attack generally by the establishment, that was just another thing to hit him with. Among the other things they tried to hit him with is because, like I said, Joe Biden literally said that if the US didn't have Israel, they'd have to create one. It's such a strategic interest the establishment have, the Western ruling elite have. They have to keep it at all costs. And Jeremy Corbyn has been the biggest threat to that we've ever seen in Britain in terms of a politician. I don't think anybody has talked in terms of Palestinian struggle the way Jeremy Corbyn has. I can't think of bar Tony Benn.
No mainstream politician. It's certainly not a leader of the opposition.
The only thing I was going to add as well is it's important to say that anti-Zionism isn't just something that's happening in amongst the Arab population and outside of in the West. There's been anti-Zionism groups in Israel for years fighting against the expansion of Israel. Working Class History Podcast, they do 2 brilliant episodes on this when they speak to people who have been part of anti-Zionism organizations within Israel. So it's not something that, like we said earlier, talking about there being resistance to Jewish expansion, to Israeli expansion in Palestine previously. There's been anti-Zionist political parties. There is still anti-Zionist political parties within Israel, and groups that have fought against it. So it's, again, being, like we said earlier, there's lots of Jewish people who are anti-Zionist, and this debate gets very quickly. There's a lot of nuance in it, basically, but for some reason that just gets completely lost, and you're either anti-Semite or you are, or you got to shut up and not talk about it, basically.
Yeah, it's good you brought that up, because actually some of the most vocal critics of Israel tend to be Orthodox Jews who both, from a religious perspective, don't believe in the foundation and continuation of the Israeli state, but also from obviously that moral perception of Israel. And, there are plenty of outspoken critics of Israel who are either Israeli themselves or Jewish themselves. Normal Finkelstein and Ilan Pappe would probably be the two that I can name off the top of my head. But they're very vocal critics of Israel, and they have, even being Jewish, being Israeli, they've been accused of anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism, obviously, it exists, but there's also a way in which anti-Semitism has been used as a bludgeon to essentially beat the opponents of the Israeli state.
Do you want to say something, Hamza? Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to quickly highlight how essentially there has been 35 Israeli Jewish scholars and academics who published an open letter, I don't know to who, but you can just Google it, stating that many victims of the Holocaust oppose Zionism and many anti-Semites support Zionism. So it's essentially, there's been academics, there's been scholars from Israeli Jewish heritage calling out Israel as a state, as an entity, and highlighting how anti-Zionism does not mean that you're an anti-Semite, and this is coming from Israeli Jewish academics and scholars. So I'm quite conscious of the fact that I'm a Muslim. I'm not Israeli. I'm not Jewish. But if Israeli Jewish people are coming out calling out Israel, then surely we just should go by what they're saying. But yeah, that's my.
But to add to that, right, is that the ridiculousness of the debate is particularly. This has come from a UK context, because obviously that's the context that we're growing up in and been looking at. That in terms of people's Jewish heritage, when criticising Israel and Zionism and Israel's policies, the British media pick and choose, like Momentum, right? You'll see people who do not like Momentum will say that it is a anti-Semitic, Jeremy Corbyn, lefty loony society. I mean, the person who's been in the chair of Momentum since its inception is John Landsman, who is of Jewish heritage. But that gets completely lost in all of the narratives about Momentum. It's the same with Rachel Riley, who's been this big critic of Jeremy Corbyn and his anti-Zionism. She tweeted in a list of anti-Semitic left-wing people, Chomsky, who is of Jewish heritage. Like, it's just all these things that just get lost. Corbyn, when obviously he was before the 20, I think maybe after the 2017 election, he spent, I believe, Passover with Judas, which is an anti-Zionist group of young Jewish people in London, and the media went crazy, and it was like, and saying that he basically, they tried to make out him spending Passover with a group of young Jews was anti-Semitic. And it's just like you say, this whole debate has just got so lost and so like foaming at the mouth, and it's just ridiculous that it's, like I say, yeah, people on the left, if you're an anti-Zionist Jew on the left, for some reason your voice doesn't matter. E.g., Michael Segalov, who went on Good Morning Britain, and he literally got called by another panelist a self-hating Jew. Like a non-Jewish person told a Jewish person that due to the fact he was an anti-Zionist, he was a self-hating Jew. Like this, It's just crazy how much the discourse in this debate has just gone 0 to 10 so quickly.
It's like this good Jew, bad Jew thing, isn't it? And there's a lot of non-Jewish people who are determining who is who, and who gets to have an opinion on Israel, and who gets to what opinions are legitimate when it comes to Israel. And I know we like to work in conversations about Dan Hodges, so this is a useful place to work that in. Around 2015, not long after Corbyn had been elected, I had a little spat with him on Twitter, because he, as someone who is not Jewish, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm fairly sure he's not Jewish. He's not. Called someone he said that a Jewish Corbyn supporter was Corbyn's useful Jewish idiot. He put that on Twitter, and I was like responding like, what? You're someone who is not Jewish talking about anti-Semitism, calling other people anti-Semites, and then, you know, trying to choose for yourself who counts as you know, a passing Jew who's got the right opinions on Israel, and then to use that phrase to a Jewish person yourself, it's just like, it shows that really they don't care about racism. They don't care. A lot of these people, like we're talking about the Labour right, a lot of these people don't care about anti-Semitism particularly at all. It was just something to beat up the left about, because they don't like the left, and especially didn't like Corbyn.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't know where you'll fit in. Maybe James, you'll just have to plop it on the end. But if we're going to talk about anti-Semitism, the Israeli state itself has some questionably anti-Semitic policies in the form of forced sterilization of Ethiopian Jews. So there's always been a large Jewish community in Ethiopia ever since the Jews were expelled from Judea during the Roman times, and you know, they obviously fled all around the Mediterranean. Some of them went south and ended up in Ethiopia. And a lot of Ethiopian Jews moved to Israel. And as recently as 2013, they were being given birth control unknowingly, unknown to them, but known to their doctors. They were being given birth control to prevent them from having children. And these are Jewish people who are being forcibly sterilized by the Israeli state. So it's really rich for Israel to turn around and call people anti-Semites when they're committing forced sterilization acts against Jews.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that kind of highlights we won't get into it, but that highlights the whole conversation about, you know, Jewishness as there are not just white Jews, there are black Jews, and they face a different sort of discrimination based on both sides of their heritage. Just one thing I thought we'd close this conversation about anti-Semitism with is, it might sound like an outrageous thing to say, but I think if you're not an anti-Zionist, you are an anti-Palestinian. You can call it Islamophobic or whatever. You're racist against Arabs. If you're supporting the Zionist project in Israel, Palestine, the expansion, which leads to so much misery, which has led to so much misery, then you're a racist of a different kind. So a lot of people say that's an outrageous thing to say, but I think it's the case. Right, so we've talked a little bit about the history of Israel-Palestine, and we talked about Zionism, talked about anti-Semitism. Now if we talk a little bit about solutions to the conflict in Israel-Palestine, and there are broadly two main solutions at least in the mainstream. One is what is proposed by both Israel, the Palestinian authorities in the West Bank, although not in Gaza, and the international community, is a two-state solution where you have some kind of Israeli state and some kind of Palestinian state. The debate is what proportions that would be in. I think, as far as I'm aware, the Palestinian authorities in the West Bank, so the Fatah is the name of the party there, they believe there should be a two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders. So the West Bank and Gaza would be completely, an autonomous free state of Palestine. But there are different interpretations of two states. Obviously, Israel, if they are at all serious about two states, they certainly don't mean two states based on pre-1967 borders. They mean two states where you would have a splintered group of small Palestinian enclaves surrounded by an Israeli state that covers 90% of the land. So that's the two-state solution, and then the one-state solution is the alternative. There are varieties of the one-state solution as well, but the main idea behind the one-state solution is you have an Israel-Palestine where it's a secular state and Jews and Arabs have equal political rights and equal representation. I think the population, as far as I'm aware, is fairly equal as well. I think it's a fair, Arab in terms of the entire region, it's fairly equal amount of Arabs and Jews. So does anyone want to talk a bit about the two-state solution and why they might be critical of it?
Well, if you accept the two-state solution, then you essentially accept that any foreign power has the authority to go into a country, eviscerate the native population, set up their own state there, and call itself legitimate. I mean, you might notice some historical parallels there with the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. These are states that are all established in the same way. And obviously, there's a solid argument that changes need to be made there as well. But
and they happen to be the biggest group of supporters of Israel in the international community,
I mean,
funnily enough as well.
Israel, like the United States, is a settler colonial state. And people have always stood up against settler colonialism. It's a specific form of colonialism where you send in your own population to expel the native population, as opposed to just setting up your own state there and living side by side with the native population. But settler colonial nations, they've never been morally justifiable. They've always required brutal oppression of the indigenous population. There's no particular reason that in Israel we should accept this. And if you accept the two-state solution, that's basically what you're saying. You're saying, Israel should have that land. You're completely delegitimizing the Palestinian struggle. You're saying that Palestinians don't have the right to return to their homes. And there are still Palestinians alive who were forced from their homes in 1947. So you're basically saying, well, these Palestinians, we don't give a shit about them. Israel is more important. So any support for the two-state solution is, in my eyes, support for settler colonial states. And I think it says a great deal about the caliber of a person's moral barometer if they can turn around and say, yeah, Israel is a legitimate state and we should just live with that fact.
I think for me there are two, I absolutely agree with all of that. I think there are two broad categories in which you can sort of place the arguments against two-state solution. One of which is the land argument. Palestinians would be given a minute fraction of their historic homeland, even in the most generous proposition of a two-state solution, which would be the pre-1967 borders. So West Bank and Gaza would be the Palestinian state. Also, it would be separated by Israel in the middle, which is another problem. So even the most generous version of two states doesn't give the Palestinians the land that they deserve. There's also, I think, falls in the land category as well. There's also the claim that it doesn't solve the refugee problem. So the 750,000 Palestinians who were expelled after the Nakba would still be, they just logically they would have to be squeezed. If they were to return, they would have to be squeezed into smaller parts of the Palestinian new Palestinian state, and it wouldn't be the places that they were kicked out from. They were kicked out of Israel, what is now Israel. And then I think the other broad category is the rights issue. What rights would Arab citizens living in Israel have? There would have to be some kind of protection for that, and currently, as we can see, there is no protection for Arab citizens in Israel. So I think those are two broad ways to categorize my critiques, at least, of the two-state solution.
I think just like kind of like just gonna like quickly overview of the issues of using states and nation as a concept of creating peace in a sense, is that using the idea of a state as a way to create harmony and unity, for me it doesn't make sense, because if we see Israel as a nation state and as a concept as a state and as an entity, we see that Israel have continually annexed Palestinian lands and have disposed Palestinian people, and there's been Palestinian refugees, and a lot of Palestinian people have died for it. So if we do have a two-state solution, exactly what is that two-state solution? Who creates that two-state solution? What does that look like for the Palestinians? What does that look like for the Israeli population? And in the current system and the way nations have developed and how the Western states have propped up nations to support the capitalist endeavor, we can just look back and understand how even the creation of the creation of two nations or two-state solutions would only prop up Israel as an entity and legitimize Israel as a state, even though in its essence and in its creation has been based on the bloodshed of Palestinian people. So the way I see it is the creation of a two-state solution in this particular system, in a capitalist system, would only further cause more harm to Palestinian people than any good. And I go on the line of get rid of borders. I go on to get rid of borders, dismantle the borders, and allow Palestinians to return back to the homeland, gain back the land, gain back their homes under the agreement of the international law and the Geneva Convention. And then we can talk about solutions.
I was going to say, the important thing that you talk about there really is people, I think maybe a lot of people think that two-state solution is the silver bullet, right? But like you said, what does it actually look like for Palestinian people? Just saying the word two-state solution does not mean that you're meeting both parties halfway. That it's actually, you're meeting one party 90% of the way, and Palestinians probably only get 10% of what they actually want. E.g., completely exemplified by what I mentioned earlier, Donald Trump's drawing of a two-state solution. A lot of people would have gone, oh, okay, well, he's done the drawing now. He's done the two states. That's both sides happy. But it's like, no, what that actually looked like was when you just by seeing the simple drawings of what was Palestine, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago to what it is then proposed to be under Donald Trump's plan, which, by the way, like we said, had absolutely no input from the Palestinian people, is every time someone talks about a two-state solution, it always needs to be backed up by, okay, what does that actually legitimately look like for Palestinian people? And is it a, like you said, after the years of bloodshed of Palestinian people, is that a fair solution that you've come to? And a lot of the times, exemplified by Trump's deal, it's just not. And it's just, like you say, it's being used as a weapon to sort of, it's being used as a stick to hit the Palestinian cause with, being like, oh, you're against peace because you're against a two-state solution. It's that point where it's like, well, yeah, but because, we've been persecuted for all these years, and then you basically tell us to just like be fucking happy with this little bit that we're offering you in some deal that you're not even a part of. It's just crazy.
Yeah, and it's just like, as we were talking about earlier, like they're not even serious about it anyway. They're not even serious about a two-state solution at all. The proposition from Netanyahu is talking about nation states. It is not a nation state, not a serious one anyway. I don't know if you guys saw it on the map when the Trump peace plan, but it was just a series of tiny little enclaves. There was Gaza on one side, and the West Bank was a series of tiny little enclaves that were all disconnected to each other, meaning that if you were in Palestine, you wanted to move to a different bit of Palestine, visit someone in a different part of the West Bank, you would have to travel through Israeli zones anyway, because they're little dots. So even if, like I said, even if we take the most generous, even if we do say that we want a two-state solution, Israel doesn't want it anyway. They want to annex the rest of Palestine and have it be part of Israel. It's the ultimate goal of the Zionist project. And unfortunately, it looks like that is the way that it's going at the minute. So we've talked a little bit about our critiques of the two-state solution, and I wanted to just talk a bit about what one state would look like as an alternative, because it's growing. It's the preferred solution of the left broadly, the serious left anyway, and it is also growing in popularity among Palestinian people as well, because the Palestinians favoured two states for decades. They thought it was the most, realistic chance at achieving some kind of Palestinian state, some rights. But now they're coming around a little bit. The polling suggests they're coming around to one state, which would basically be, as we said, you can call it whatever you want. You call it Israel, Palestine, Palestine, Israel. Come up with a new word for it, where the entire land would be one state where Jews and Arabs live. Hopefully, you would want it to be harmonious. They would have equal rights. There would be. It's almost like the Northern Ireland model, where there's a power. It's structured in a way that representatives from both communities, because the Catholics are a minority in Northern Ireland, both communities have to be represented at the highest level of government. So it would work a little bit like that, I suppose, at least in the interim. And that way, the reason I'm a supporter of it is because that way you don't have to give the Palestinians a minute fraction of what was their homeland. The refugee problem can be solved. I suppose the one problem with it is how realistic it is. But I mean, we need a solution. So that's the one I think is the most just at the moment. Anyway.
I think, like, even when we're just talking about, like, earlier on in the podcast, we were talking about the earlier influx of Jewish immigrants in the land of Palestine. We noticed that, well, we saw that the Jewish people were happy to settle alongside the Arabs, the Muslims in Palestine, and they accepted that they were a citizen and as a guest, not as a colonial. Not as in colonial organization ready to take over Palestinian land, and the Palestinian Arabs actually incorporated that in their charter programs, in one of the state programs. Can't remember exactly what it's called, and they were happy enough to give the equal rights to Jewish migrants who did migrate to Palestine. So there's no reason why this can't exist, even after the Nakba and after the annexation, along as the fact that the Palestinians have a right to return to the homeland. And there's also a redistribution of wealth as well, because it's really important that we highlight that, because Palestinian people have are often, especially in the land of Palestine, are often from the working class background and do not have a right to certain properties, certain lands, and certain rights to certain accesses to healthcare and education. So there needs to be a redistribution of wealth as well to the Palestinian people. There needs to be equal access to healthcare and education. And Palestinian people deserve to be, well, they should go back. There needs to be a recognition that Palestinian people deserve to go back to the homeland and re-enter the lands that have been annexed during 1948 and even before then as well.
Here. Absolutely. So if we talk about now what you can do as a Palestinian activist, we can talk in the UK context or global context, what you can do to support the Palestinian cause. So it'd be interesting if we talk a bit about BDS. Does someone want to describe or explain what BDS is all about?
So essentially, BDS is a boycott, divestment, sanction. it is called upon by the Palestinian people living in Palestine right now, and even throughout the years, to essentially boycott, divest, and sanction Israel. By boycott, what I mean is essentially withdrawing support for Israeli apartheid regime. So that is refusing or boycotting any form of corporations or any form of systems or even the government, and refusing to partake in the apartheid. By divestment, I mean urging institutions, for example, the universities throughout the UK are quite complicit in terms of supporting certain institutions in Israel, such as the Hebrew University, and cutting off and dismantling or disconnecting themselves with these institutions that exist, that will essentially impact the Israeli state, because they will obviously not gain that recognition and will not gain the capital to continue the annexation. And sanctions, I think what is meant is the withdrawing or removing Israel from the UN Council and any of its membership around the entities that exist right now.
It's a difficult position in terms of, if you take up the BDS cause, right, that there's, where do you draw the line in terms of boycotts? So do you have to start boycotting products that are made through prison labor in America, like Microsoft products? Do you have to boycott things that come from out of somewhere like Saudi Arabia, that is, obviously doing unspeakable things in places like Yemen? So that's just the criticism I've seen. I just wanted to sort of get people's thoughts on that, on why, if this is a legit, how do we explain to people that this is a legitimate way of helping the Palestinian people, without also saying like we're just particularly talking about this one issue of oppression, when there's obviously like a million others going on in the world?
Yeah, I just want to highlight how essentially we can see this as a legitimate campaign, because it's actually called upon by Palestinian people living in Palestine themselves. So if they're calling out something that is needed, which is the BDS, then surely we should obviously honor that and respect that and continue this fight for them. Another thing I want to highlight is about, okay, so should we then boycott Microsoft because of the prison labor, etc., etc.? And I think, whilst I think as individuals and as activists and learners and academics and members of the British Day or whatever, I think we all have a responsibility to have that political consciousness, to be a bit more sustainable, and just to have that idea of that we can try to do things alternatively, or we can perhaps buy things through ethical means, etc. However, I really want to highlight that this is not about the consumer in itself. It's about the corporations that exist, that allow the apartheid to continue to oppress Palestinian people and allow the Israeli state to ethnically cleanse Palestinian people. And this is something that has been brought up by Palestinian people themselves. So I think what we need to do is actually highlight institutions and corporations that are aiding what we now know as Israel to be an apartheid state.
Yeah, just to address some of the devil's advocate kind of criticisms, and I've seen them as well, even by people on the left, like you say. I think the idea that this idea comes up a lot, that us on the left kind of prioritize Israel Palestine as an issue, and that if we're going to boycott places that invest in Israel or Israeli goods themselves, then we have to boycott every single blah blah. And I think that to an extent that's probably true. You should try and avoid. I think ethical consumption is an important thing, but no one can do it perfectly. The same way with works with BDS, and it is more important to get these sort of large scale corporations to be boycotted. I mean, sounds unrealistic, but they're an important part of it. Like we said. Another thing that I wanted to say is that BDS is kind of, it's obviously all about directly financially affecting Israel, of course, and sending a message, but it's also a campaign in itself. It's about a way of getting the Palestinian voice heard. Like we said, the Palestinians are asking for this, but they're asking for it for multiple reasons, and one of those reasons is actually that it's a campaign in itself. It's part of the movement, and it's hopefully, in the same way that it happened in South Africa, hopefully one day it will highlight to more and more people the need for a support of the Palestinian cause and an end to the apartheid regime in Israel.
And like you said there, it highlights the importance of us as, what we socialists and on the left of showing international solidarity, that it isn't just a thing you say out loud. Sort of, I mean, we talked about it with Black Lives Matter and things like that to try and seem woke or whatever. Actually, listening to what Palestinians want, and they want us to help them boycott, divest, and sanction. That you can really show international solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, and as a result, educate more people on that topic, and obviously just grow the movement here. So it's just to highlight the importance of showing international solidarity with this issue, but other issues around the world, that it really does have an effect. You sort of like flying the flag for that struggle in your country, which obviously sometimes seems a million miles away.
And I kind of just want to echo what Dan has to say about solidarity. Is I kind of want to mention about the importance of developing connections between oppressions, because we all know that oppression is not just a linear form; it's it operates in very insidious and multiple ways. And we can kind of look at this. For example, there has been the recent killing of an autistic Palestinian man named Ayad Halak, I believe, and he had been shot 10 times and killed because the Israeli people just saw him as a threat. And this is an issue with regards to the fact that this disability is seen as a threat for the Israeli people, and this kind of links well with the ongoing campaigns in Britain and the UK, in the US, of building that understanding of disability and creating the rights for disability people and access to certain companies, etc., and just having that understanding that there is a connection that Palestinian disabled people are actually being killed in Israel, but British disabled people are also are actually being murdered by the state through austerity measures as well. So just building that connection, I think, is really important. Also want to highlight, obviously, the issue with the prison industrial complex, especially within the US. There's a company called the G4S, which operates on a private manner. Essentially, they create a lot of prisons in I would say, indigenous lands or in the working class communities, and the way they operate is that they provide security for the big organizations like banks and corporations, and also the government as well. And it's and this exists, G4S as a company exists in Israel too, and essentially what they do, they use land that has been annexed, and they have created a prison system for the Israeli state to subjugate Palestinian people to incarcerations. So when we talk about prison abolition, we're not just mentioning prison abolition in America or in the UK, but we're also talking about prison abolition in Palestine as well, and getting rid of not only the material conditions of punishment, but also changing the psychic and the ideology that links crime to punishment as well. So just trying to build that connection, I think, is really important. I hope I explained that. But yeah,
I think Hamza highlights something that I think is really important about the Palestinian issue, is that we need to make sure people know what it's about, and it's about suffering and the suffering of the Palestinian people, and putting a stop to that. And I think one of the things that really pisses me off about the British media, or the global media really, is that they kind of get caught up in these kind of academic discussions about, is this anti-Semitic, this exact thing that he said anti-Semitic, or is this, they don't actually talk and highlight the stories that are actually going on in Palestine, the daily oppression that, if you're outside of the mainstream media, you can see it, with your own eyes online, all the time. So I think it's like important to
living in a fucking open air prison.
Literally. And David Cameron said that, and he's not exactly known for being the pro-Palestinian activist or anything. So I think it's important it's important that we keep highlighting to people when you're out there advocating for Palestinian rights that it's a real world, fucked up issue. Like, there are people suffering. There's no time even to have these discussions like we have in the media. Is Corbyn the new Hitler or whatever because he supports Palestinian rights? So I think that's one way in which we can actually carve through and get our message out there.
Yeah, and I think just like making it relatable as well, and just understanding that Palestinian right is the right for all marginalized communities as well. So just having that connection, developing that understanding, and making it relatable would not only help people who I guess are not well read on the topic, but also it will help develop that collective consciousness to actually organize and actually target states and corporations that have been complicit in the Israeli apartheid system.
Perfect. Has anyone else got anything to say before we wrap up?
Oh, I was just going to say, there's one thing. If you guys want to, if the listeners, or if obviously anyone else who listen to this, if you guys want to like partake and actually get into this cause and fight for the Palestinian rights, I would recommend visiting Apartheid Off Campus. So they are a recent organizations that have come up in fruition recently, but it's been a long-lasting campaign throughout the years. What it does, it highlights the complicity of all institutions and how they're complicit in the apartheid system, mainly British universities, and looks at how the corporations that the British University Fund is actually part of a corporation that aid Israel as well. For example, the Hebrew University, for instance, has been created on the land of Palestinian land and Palestinian illegal settlements. And essentially what they do is not only reiterate Israeli propaganda, but they also have a little camp and a base that allow IDF soldiers to actually train. And a lot of the universities have been sending out students to this university, Hebrew University, and it just goes to show how insidious other institutions are in being complicit to what is now known as the apartheid system. So I would definitely recommend going to Apartheid Off Campus and visiting what they have, seeing what they have to say.
I also just want to give a shout out quickly to the Minyan Podcast, which is a podcast by a group of communist Jews. If you're interested in exploring Jewish history, radical Jewish history, and the Israel-Palestine conflict more broadly from a Jewish perspective, we'll leave a link in the description. Definitely worth checking out.
Thank you very much for coming on, Hamza. It's some
thank you
some
for
great insight.
having me.
Yeah, no worries. Some great insight there. Yeah, if you want to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, Podbean, Spotify, we're on all the podcast sites, so give us a listen. Well, you already are if you're listening to this, but give us a like on Facebook and Twitter. Yeah, thanks, guys.
Cool and nice.